Welcome to TradeTheMBI.com. This is John. This report is for the 30th of January. Well, you can see we've been pretty much sideways across this algo level right around the 26.35. Not a whole lot stopping any move to the 26.99 except for, well, roughly the time of the month. It is interesting that we're holding right at this support because obviously at the beginning of the month, new fund money will come in around the 4th or so. And that would be the next opportunity to see any kind of boost. We've still had continued rising DOC red, which is just about to get above this peak, which is critical because at that point you would expect to see a move to the upside. Well, we noticed that once we had the gold rising, is one of those where until it flattens out your opportunity to get a strong short move, is usually limited. It's something we see intraday as well as well, on all the other charts as well. And in this particular case from the NASDAQ, a little bit different because of the way the orange behaved. Didn't quite dip below. That's why we're not getting a super thrust out of it so far. But even with the soft shakeout readings, again, it's that same rising gold. Now, in this case, when you see that Azure sort of flatten out, well, that's sort of a little bit of a warning sign, potentially. We need to see that steel dip below sign, just like it's doing here at the pre-market beginning. But you'd also need to have orange pop above, and then you'd want to see some more separation going on between the green and red to really finalize it. But a short snake in there would be just enough to give you the potential for things to start moving in the downside direction. The euro, nice pop off of what had been that previous move. We saw the nice bounce right here as it turned around with the DOC going in there. You didn't expect much from that until this green got above cyan. So still looking fairly decent. Gold has been the takeaway. We kind of saw that reset taking place. Went from, well, the overbought conditions. DOC resets completely and starts a new leg up, and that's why we expected it to break out as it did. No real shock with that one. Intraday, kind of an interesting setup. We'd had those peak moves. We came through, we're talking about this situation where you end up with that spread separation. We didn't get a move of the magenta below the negative 13.5. It came very close to it, but even if you followed that split the spread, the problem is that you ended up with the positive extreme. So once it filled the positive extreme and you were still seeing that significant separation, in this particular case, well, gosh, if we look at the numbers, it was significantly over. So if you take the magenta 9 versus the yellow, you're looking at 11 points. When it first crossed over, back over here, it was just under 2. And then you finally went to the full 2.5 plus, but that's where the positive extreme was. So you'd have to wait for that one to fill back in. So even if you took it at the close opportunity, there's fine as well, except for you'd like to see a stronger move up from the magenta. It was sort of flat hanging on there, and then as soon as it popped up, you had lower price, and that created a nice move. Going through, we ended up with the classic DOC spread right over here, right at the 0 point. Always a critical one. You watch the yellow dip below, and that produced a nice dip down. We ended up with the dip below the red line, and right as that happened, you end up with the green one. That's where you get your warning sign. Happens to be at the 50%. Bells start going off at that point. You get the pop-up. This is an interesting one because for me, it's one of those where I'll usually cover at this particular point. This wasn't significant enough for me to want to turn around for the long. I just look for a shorter move to where it sort of fades out shy of the previous peak. Sometimes it'll get all the way back up to the high, or even try to make a higher high on the lower shakeout reading. But in this particular case, no, and that led to a very nice dip. And then we got down here, and this is what we were talking about on the Skype chat. I'll increase the size of it so we can get it clearer. So we ended up with the dip below the orange, and we didn't quite have the crossover yet. And so by the time we came here, we get the crossover. Let me get that number spread to show up. I kind of increased the size of the shakeout so you'd be able to see it a little bit easier. I don't think I can get it into your screen all the way, but it satisfied the requirements. The only difference wasn't at its full peak, and again, we were talking about that possibility of wanting to see that magenta rise a little bit. You could start there, but you certainly get the much clearer signal when it moves above, and this is where I was pointing out this on the Skype chat. You're getting a weak signal that might convince you to want to short. You don't have the steel crossing below cyan yet, but what you're seeing is the fact that that yellow is staying above magenta and in fact increasing its spread even in what you might consider a little bit softer reading. You're matching pretty close to your previous pivot, and like I was saying on the Skype chat, hey, you're looking for this beginning of gold rising, and as soon as it does, that's when I'm looking at it, because at this particular point I'm like, okay, well, is my spread still maintaining itself, or has it narrowed to the point where I've got to be concerned? And in this particular case, it was staying above that threshold, and that's when you get the full turnaround. And then by the time you get the orange below at that spot, you've already begun this move. Azure starts to rise, and again, nothing really flattens out until you get this lower peak. Works out beautifully, and then this classic viewpoint right here where you get the separation, boom. And I usually look for where we get that peak move, and that's when the cyan starts to come down. Then I'm looking for a turnaround of my green, sort of the closing of this little mouth, because that's usually the indication that you're going to get your turnaround. And then, of course, it happened as well right about there. You can see that you end up with your 2.5 easy right there. 2 1/4 is usually significant enough, and it just kind of trades sideways on that. Again, until you get a little bit more of that separation, but you get green moving above. So this was all looking pretty good, even though price still fades a little bit, and then sure enough, you get this kind of move right after it. So it's an effective way to manage within a 5K scenario. If we're looking at the 50K, getting closer with our stop adjustments and that, the new paint bar setup, it tends to follow. I haven't included all of the little buy scenarios yet, but some of them where buys in early like this and you get your full retrace, we would be getting our buy right where we're getting our X's in that. So it's a little bit different, but what you tend to avoid is being in a green and then having it come back down and revisiting that kind of setup. You can look at a couple others here. So scrolling back a little bit, like this one where we had the Opus would buy just a little bit earlier. We have the X's. I haven't included some of those from an X2 standpoint, but it'll end up buying pretty close to the similar configuration, and then exit out will be probably just a little bit earlier than the Opus exited out on this one, and more likely than not, when you have that consolidation, it will give us the new setup when we're at the higher zones, the whole separate category I have for above the 76 level. But it's just a nice augment to it to have it match what the MBI Opus 2, it's called the PowerMo Opus 2, does, and it sort of gives it a matching configuration. I haven't looked at it in a little while, but we can take a look at what the Opus 2 has been doing. It's a very modest profit factor on that 1.2. If we look at the periodic returns, though, just for January, it's having pretty incredible 62% profitable just for the month of January. So it was an impressive January when you compare it to the previous year. Interesting to see that kind of dramatic change, not at all-time equity highs, but once my adjustments are made with some of these other entries, and the losses will reduce quite a few of them, which will really skyrocket that profit factor. And the neat part about it is I've worked on some of the alerts to where the email and alert that it sends will include the variables of what the stops are, and so you'll be able to get a much more detailed alert setup that will actually give you what the current stop set at blah 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 from the entry. And that's kind of exciting, because before we had somewhat of a more limited alert configurations that it gave, so kind of exciting on some of the expanded program capabilities that it has now. So look forward to adding all those things into it, and it'll be neat when this matches. And then what I'm working on also is the ABM that will reset exactly at these buy configurations, so you'll be able to see that from a follow standpoint for those that want to trade in between setups, because while this tends to want to look for a little bit longer play, there are plenty of times where you have little short opportunities within a overall long trade, as well as vice versa. And planning on adding the short configuration into it, which has not been a feature of it before, which I think that will be a neat element to have in there. So a lot of exciting stuff, and we'll have I may even include the where I'm at current on the work on this DLCon Paint 2, just so you'll have it, so that when I do finally make the update, it will probably just erase the original one. But if you want to take a look at how it's developing, it'll give you an opportunity to kind of play with it, just so you can follow along with some of the stuff that we're working on. As always, though, trade well, and you can check your emails for the update for indicators for February. I'll be getting that out to you well, during the trading day at some point, so that you'll be all set to be ready for when the first comes at the end of the week. As always, though, trade well, and getting closer to getting rid of this cold or flu or whatever it is, and hopefully be back to 100%. As always, though, trade well. We'll talk to you later.